So we want worship to continue. And so this week, the praise band released a single that we put up on the Facebook page. I think there's a link right here, right there. And so we want you to be able to download that so your worship can continue throughout the week, and also that you might share it with somebody. I think what happens with the music here on Sunday mornings is shareable. And so I would love for you to share that with folks. Also, if you're not connected with the church Facebook page, please do so. I think you'll get some really good content on that. We also want to make sure that we do take time to acknowledge this is spring break. And so we've got a lot of people that are worshiping with us online, and we want to make sure that they know that they are included as well. And so if you're worshiping with us online, please post where you're vacationing right now. We'd love to participate and celebrate with you vicariously. So let us know where you are this morning. So if you think about this time last year, up to this point over the last 12 months, question that we asked last week that we'll ask this week is, what are all the changes and transitions that you have gone through? Since this time last year to right now, what are all the different changes and transitions that you have gone through? The reason I ask you that question is because we all experience change and transition differently. We talked about this last week, that just in general, some of us see that as a sign of danger. Others of us are really hesitant because of the uncertainty. And then others of us look at a change and a transition as an opportunity to see what God is up to. But if last week was more general in nature, today we're going to make it personal. What changes in your world are you experiencing? Not in general, but specifically. What changes in your world are you experiencing? One that all of us in the room is experiencing that will impact your world because your schedule on Sunday mornings are going to be impacted, and the relationships that you have with one another might be impacted. A change that each of you that are experiencing in your world right now is that in about 4 weeks, our schedule is going to change. And for some of you, you're like, whoa, I didn't sign up for this, and I don't want that. I like consistency, and I like knowing what's going on. So you're having to navigate that. Others of you, that change doesn't really impact you. You're like, praise God, I get to sleep a little bit later, and it's hard to get here anyway on time, and it'll be fine. Worship may not be that big of a deal or that schedule change. But your world is impacted by the changes that are going on with your family. No one else knows what's going on with your family except you. Either your immediate family with your spouse or with your kiddos or with your extended family. And your world is being impacted by change and transition right now. And so it's one thing to talk about change and transition in an abstract, general way. It's another thing to get hit right in the gut with it, that there are some things that are going on. If it's not your family, maybe it's, maybe you recently made a move. It may be a move in the community. But maybe you've changed houses, you've changed neighborhoods, so therefore you've actually changed friends a little bit. You're not hanging around with the same people that you used to hang around with because you've changed locations. Others of you have health things that are impacting your world right now. Maybe you have a new baby in the household. Maybe you've gotten a diagnosis from the doctor. But once again, we're not talking about change in general. We're talking about change in your world. That's the focus that we're on today. I came across a quote from somebody that I think is so true, and it wasn't attributed to anyone. I'm just saying that I didn't come up with it, but it's so true. And it says, when you go through a hard time, I pray. When I go through a hard time, I doubt. Because it's personal. It's personal. And today we want to make it personal because Jesus is personal. In fact, there's a great history of this, that when our world changes, Jesus shows up. In John chapter 11, there's a story of Lazarus and Martha and Mary, and Lazarus had died, and Jesus is part of the scene. This is in your GPS. We're also going to throw it up here on the screen. So hear these words of grace. On his arrival, Jesus found that Lazarus had been in the tomb for 4 days. Now, Bethany was less than 2 miles from Jerusalem, and many Jews had come to Martha and Mary to comfort them in the loss of their brother. When Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went out to meet him, but Mary stayed at home. Lord, Martha said to Jesus, let's all say this together. If you had been here, my brother would not have died. Change no longer was an abstract idea for them. but now it was personal. As we go into this time of the message, where we're expecting grace to intersect with your adapting to change, I would like for us all to join together in this prayer. Let me share it with you first, and then maybe you can share it with me if you feel compelled to do so. Here's a prayer that I would love for us all to pray as we go into this time together. Lord, when my world changes and I am at my weakest, replace my prayers, if only you had been there, with thank you for not leaving me. If you can pray that prayer, let's all join together. Lord, when my world changes and I am at my weakest, replace my prayers of, if only you had been there, with, thank you for not leaving me. May it be so. So be it. So when I'm thinking about when my world changes, when I'm having to adjust, not just you anymore, but when I'm having to adjust, I try to remember that I'm not the first one to have gone through changes. There's nothing new under the sun. We all experience changes in different ways. We don't get out of this world without changes and transitions. So when I go back and look at the story of Lazarus and Mary and Martha, there's some things that stand out to me that I hope will stand out to you as well. And I'm going to frame these things that stand out to me in the form of a question. Because I found that questions are like hooks, statements are like bats. You don't need more information. You need to be invited to a life transformation. And a question invites you in like a hook. So here's the first question. When your world changes, do you know that you belong to Jesus? Now, the reason I ask that question is, as I know, look, you're in church. You could be any place else in this world, but you're at church or you're watching online. So we can kind of assume safely that, okay, y'all think that y'all might belong to Jesus. However, let's look at that for just a second. Do you know that you belong to Jesus? See, Mary and Martha and Lazarus knew that they belonged to Jesus because they had an ongoing relationship with Jesus. This passage of scripture that we have in John chapter 11 wasn't just all of a sudden Jesus showed up on the scene and had to introduce himself to Mary and Martha, and oh yeah, by the way, they were grieving their brother Lazarus. No, they'd had an ongoing, thriving relationship with one another. And so they knew each other. They related to one another. They were there for each other in the high times and the low times before this moment. And so a friend is someone that's born out of adversity. A friend is someone who knows who you are. That old cliche is, friend is someone who knows who you are and likes you anyway. And this is what's going on with Jesus and Mary and Martha and Lazarus. Now, as I was thinking about this, having this ongoing relationship, knowing that I belong to Jesus, that means that there's an ongoing back and forth. There's an ongoing engagement. The best friends that I have are friends that there are engagements going on. And then I was thinking about my social media thing. I've got over 1,000 friends. Are y'all impressed? I've got over 1,000 friends on Facebook. No oohs and ahs. I mean, that number should be just awesome, right? And I found myself that on occasion, I'm actually in a room with some of those people. And how funny it is that on social media, we will share things, but yet when we are in a room together, we can't put two words together to be in conversation with one another. It may just that I can't make small talk. Maybe you can do that. But there's a huge difference between friends that engage with one another. Not just the perception on social media, but they engage with one another. They know that they belong to one another as opposed to things on social media. I love having all those connections. Please don't unfriend me, but if you do, it's going to be okay. But, having those connections are great. But there are friends that I know that I belong to them, and they belong to me. On social media, you can just unclick somebody and there's no harm, no foul. But a friend is someone who's there with you through the high times and the low times. We need to know that we belong to Jesus through that ongoing relationship. The early Christian church understood this as well. The Apostle Paul was writing to the Christians in Rome. And in his 8th chapter of the letter that he was writing, he wrote this. For those who are led by the Spirit of God are the what? Oh man, that speaks to a relationship. The Spirit you received does not make you slaves so that you live in fear again. Rather, the Spirit you received brought about your what? Yes. And by him we cry, Abba, Father. The Spirit himself testifies to our spirit that we are God's. So do you know that you belong to Jesus? Some of you are automatically going to think, well, I was baptized in a church a long time ago, or I went through confirmation, and I've been away from the church for a while, but I've just started having a family, so I'm coming back now, and you're doing what you perceive to be the right thing is, or you come to church most often on Sundays, or you worship with us online, and you know this is what you need to be doing, but when change and transition happens, you forget that you belong to Jesus. You forget that there may have been a transaction at some point where you received the grace of Jesus, but it's almost like you've become social media friends. Officially, you're friends, but you haven't lived life together. Mary and Martha and Lazarus lived life together, and because they did, they were able to face death together. The next question to maybe think about is this: when your world changes, what promises do you stand on? What promises do you stand on when change and transition happen? When you're experiencing the change of a Sunday morning schedule, what promises are you standing on? When you're experiencing the changes and transitions of health and family and work and moving and whatever else that you're going through, what promises do you stand on? Mary and Martha and Lazarus stood firmly on the promise that Jesus wasn't just a good guy. He wasn't just charismatic. He just wasn't nice. It wasn't that he just liked them more than anybody else. The promises that they stood on is that they were clear that Jesus was the Messiah. He was the promised one. He was the one that was going to turn the world right side up. So not only did they have an ongoing relationship with him, but they were clear in understanding who Jesus was. What are the promises that you stand on when you're going through changes and transitions? For many of us, when we experience change and transition, our faith sometimes just flies out the window because it wasn't anchored in the first place. So we fall into the trap of thinking, well, I've got to suck this up, and I've got to figure this out, and this is really going to be awful. And I hate change, and I hate transition, and there's a lot of me, I. But what are the promises that you stand on? I know that every change and transition from what we know is like a little death. And we mourn those things that we don't have anymore. We mourn those routines, and we mourn those schedules, and we mourn those relationships, and we mourn just what our normal has been. That's normal. But what can become abnormal, or what can become a disease, is that we don't find a way to navigate through those normal mourning periods, and it becomes almost like a cancer that eats us from the inside out. I have the high honor and privilege of presiding over different memorial services at different times. And I know that when I'm speaking in front of people and they're mourning deeply, more often than not, I'm assuming they don't really hear what I'm saying. Because you're caught up in the moment, you're in grief, there's been a change and a transition that has happened. I get it, that's normal. But for all of those who have ears to hear at that moment, there's words that we recite at every memorial service and funeral that gives us a foundation upon which to stand. And here are the words of Jesus that we share at every service, that we stand on these because they're the promises that we cling to. And it's these words. Jesus said, I am resurrection and I am life. Those who believe in me, even though they die, yet shall they live. And whoever lives and believes in me shall never die. I am Alpha and Omega, the beginning and the end, the first and the last. I died, and behold, I'm alive forevermore. And I hold the keys of hell and death. Because I live, you shall live also. For some of you who are experiencing the death of change, the death that comes along with change and transitions, you need to understand that Jesus came not to give you a life of scarcity, but a life of abundance. And because he lives, you shall live also. Another question to keep in mind is that when your world changes, do you know that that's not the end of the story? Whatever that thing is that you are going through right now, that your world is changing, do you know that when you're caught right in the middle of it, you know, hopefully, don't you, that that's not the end of the story? Just for perspective, and I love this part. In John chapter 11, we hear the story about Lazarus and Mary and Martha, and just the pain that came with that, but also the joy. But did you know that there's not only a John chapter 11, but there's a John chapter 12 where the story of Lazarus and Mary and Martha with Jesus continues? That when we're caught right in the middle of the storm, the only thing we can see is what we're experiencing right now, those emotions that we feel, those tensions that we are experiencing, those warning signs of danger, that quicksand of uncertainty that we were walking over. And many times it's not until we've kind of gotten outside of that we can see that there's a rest of the story. Whenever there's a change in transition, it's like Good Friday. Good Friday is where Jesus is laid upon the cross. And we go into Good Friday and go, oh my God, thank you for the love that you have for us. And we may not know the rest of the story, but for every Good Friday, know that there's an Easter Sunday. And that which died on one day will be resurrected by Jesus another day. And whatever that change in transition is, know that that's not the end of the story. In fact, I was talking with Jordan this week, our praise team leader, and I was sharing with her about this. And I asked her to share her thoughts, and because I know a little bit of her story and how her world has changed over the last 3 years or so. So I asked her if she would share the story, and I wouldn't get off the phone until she said yes. So she said yes, and I asked her if she wanted to read it or share it, and she said no. And I said, okay, I'll do it, but I can't do her voice very well. So I'm going to read it, but using my voice on this. But I want you to listen to see how all the changes that Jordan has gone through, it might be an example for you. That which we thought was the end of the story is not. So here's what Jordan said. 3 years ago, I was traveling the world with my husband. We were living in Austin, where we'd been for over a decade, and I was working as a full-time musician. Life was good. And then my world changed. I had to say goodbye to one of the most important people in my life. I left the city that I loved, and we started over here in Granbury, where my family was. My heart was broken over losing my stepmom, who had been a mother to me since childhood, and I was grieving the loss of my home and the city and friends that I loved. I went through the hardest season of my life. I became depressed. And I related to Mary and Martha when they said, Lord, if you had been here, things would have been better. He wouldn't have died. I wouldn't be hurting like this. I never doubted God was with me. I knew that he was, but I wondered why. Why didn't he intervene? Why did it have to go this way? Why couldn't he save us from this pain? It's 3 years later, and I still miss my stepmom. I still hurt over my loss. But I can honestly say that I love Jesus more now than I did then. And I trust Jesus more now than I did then. And there's a depth to my faith that hadn't been developed then. And I believe that's because I walked through the hard changes with him. And through these years, I've seen beauty come from ashes, and I've seen life come from death. From my pain, I wrote an album of worship songs that has been meaningful to many others who have walked through grief and loss. It's been a humbling privilege for my offering, for my own journey to be used to minister to others. God has blessed me with beautiful relationships that I wouldn't have known, and that includes this church and the people and our band, who have been such a blessing in my life. There's been more music and opportunities and friendships than I can mention at this time. But the greatest blessing that has come from walking through my world changing is a deeper walk with him. Because ultimately, that is what is most important. When all of life fades away and I stand before Christ, I want to have known Christ and him deeply. Jesus said that Lazarus' death and resurrection was for the glory of God. In the very next chapter, Jesus, knowing that he is about to face his darkest hour, says, "Now is my soul troubled. And what shall I say? Father, save me from this hour? Before this purpose I have come to this hour. Father, glorify your name. I'm so thankful that Jesus walked through the hardest things for me. If Christ hadn't walked through the dark night of the soul and faced the most painful thing imaginable, you and I would have no hope. Praise be to God that he did. I long to be more like Jesus when facing the hard things in my life. And for my reaction in my prayer to shift from, save me from this, to glorify your name through this. What happens when your world changes? In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, and all God's people said,